Welcome to the Keen on Keller podcast. I am your host, Sherry Almond. I hope you all are having a wonderful new year and keeping those resolutions. After all, we're only in day 9 of the new year, so let's keep pushing through those resolutions together. One of my biggest resolutions this year was getting this podcast up and running. So far, so good. And bonus, I'm having so much fun getting to know our wonderful community of Keller. I really appreciate you all tuning in to Keen on Keller. Episode 1 is going to be a brief history of Keller, and it is sponsored by Councilman Sean Hicks, who happens to be a history buff. Sean heard we were starting with the history of Keller and graciously sponsored this first podcast. So thank you, Councilman Hicks. And you will get to know more about Sean and his wonderful wife, Renee, in a later podcast, so please stay tuned. Now, back to what we were talking about today, the history of Keller. I think many of us moved to Keller for various reasons. It could have been the school district, Keller's location, the parks and trails. But whatever brought you here, you may not know the history of our town. In my search for who would know the most history of Keller, I found a wonderful place. And it's a little yellow house located in Old Town Keller. It's on Bates Street, and it's called the Wild Heritage Museum. And it is there that I got to visit with the executive director, Kathy Jackson, who then turned me on to a local author by the name of Joyce Gibson Roach. Now, Joyce is 84 years old, and she's lived in Keller for 54 years, and she is truly the keeper of many of Keller's wonderful notes, pictures, and stories from the earliest settlers. And so what follows is really just a mere blip to all the stories Joyce can regale. I hope you enjoy listening to her as much as I did. Here we go. Please join me in welcoming today's guest, Joyce Gibson Roach, a longtime resident of Keller, author and folklorist who penned a book entitled Wild Rose, a folk history of a cross-timber settlement, Keller, Texas. Joyce, thank you so much for joining me on Keen on Keller today and helping our listeners take a quick journey into the past.
You're welcome. I'm glad to join you on the podcast. This is terribly exciting. It's quite an honor.
We are excited too, and believe me, the honor is ours. First, I'd like to start off with a little history about you before we delve into your book.
All right.
How long have you lived in Keller?
54 years.
54 years. Always in the same location?
No, not in the same location. I started out housekeeping with a young baby north of here. In fact, it was on Highway 170 where the Ameritrade building is. So that's a good place to mark it, but in the area, and it was like living in the country, as if living in Keller was not country enough.
And you were also a history teacher, I believe, here in Keller.
I was predominantly an English teacher, and but there came a point when you could do things a little differently back then, and I said, would you let me arrange a course on Texas history, because there is no Texas history taught in high school. Even now that's true unless it's a special course. And could I also develop a course in Southwestern literature and life? And the answer was yes, and I developed a curriculum and taught that course for many years, but I also taught English.
And it was my understanding your history class sounds like one that I would have enjoyed, because didn't you actually take the students to Old Town Keller?
Yes, I did, and I would be fired for such a move today because I didn't ask anyone if I could do that. I just sort of walked off campus. You know where the Capital One Bank was. I don't know what they're doing with it now, but the Lyda White house, Hugh White's house, was not 2 blocks from there. And so when I knew there was time to walk to the Lyda White's house and do what we wanted to do, listen to Lyda tell stories, or I'd tell stories, then we'd turn around and get back to campus before anybody knew we were gone. So,
oh, I bet your students loved that.
They did, and well, we all loved it. So did Lyda, and so did I. It was a good time, and it was certainly a valuable lesson.
You bet. So, what got you interested in the history of Keller?
The cemetery. That sounds like a strange place to begin, but when you come into a town, I had grown up in Jacksboro, and there never was a place like it, and there never will be. It'll always be home to me. But I didn't find anything of much interest here until I started teaching school, but I discovered Mount Gilead Cemetery. So I think I could tell you that I fell in love with those people I had never met in the cemetery as a starting point with history. And so many of the students' relatives were buried there and at Borland Cemetery. So as a consequence, I got attached to those folks in the cemetery real quickly, and what opened the door for me historically, and that was Lida White. You've heard me mention her name, and this book of mine is dedicated to her. She had records, narratives, everything you can think of, genealogies that she'd been collecting for half a lifetime here. And when we became more acquainted and better friends, she said, "Joyce, I'm going to write a book someday, but I could see that it'll never be done, that there's not enough time." And she said, "But you will write the book. You've written other books and you'll write this book, I know." So she said, "When I die, I want this material to pass into your hands." And that is exactly what happened. It came to me, and I used it in not only this book, but another book about a town locally.
Okay, so that's what got you started, and you did write the book, Wild Rose, A Folk History of a Cross Timber Settlement, Keller,
Yes,
Texas.
Right.
You know, and I have a question. Why Wild Rose? Where does that come from?
Well, it comes from we did grow wild roses here all along 377 over on the east side, and they were wild and they were put there. I knew why they were there. I looked into it. They were used as a stopping point to keep animals off the highway, because the wild rose has long canes and huge thorns on it, and it would stop an animal, and they were growing profusely and very thick along the highway. In 1993, the highway department, and in concert with Keller City Council, decided that the highway had to be widened. And so I went out one day, and bulldozers had dug up all those roses, and there were those vicious canes clutching at the sky as they'd once clung to the earth. So I went back home and put on some heavy clothes and gloves and got some nippers and went out and saved all that I could. And there are several wild white roses growing everywhere. They were first called by some the Cherokee rose, but by some these are the McCartney rose. They bloom only once a year. But it occurred to me that these roses and people were very much alike: stubborn, tenacious, not going to give up easily, and even with little care grew profusely, even without water. So it seemed to me that it was a good title for a book, because it epitomized the citizens, the people who came here. And the idea of with the cross timbers, a folk history of the cross timbers, the region that Keller sits squarely in is in the cross timbers. Large forest, you can't see that now, but large forest and groves of post oak trees. Some of the vegetation was so thick that it couldn't even be passed through. This was before settlers came here. The Spanish discovered this area in the 1700s. They were looking for places for reservations and missions to put the Indian population. And when they came up close to the southern part of the timbers, don't know where because it stretches for many counties and many miles, but they said, "This day we have come across a great forest," which they called the Monte Grande. "We're going to stop here and rest." But they lost a sword. In fact, they lost 2 swords there, and I've wondered ever since what's happened to those swords all those hundreds of years ago, but they're gone now anyway. But that was the beginning of my interest in the cross timbers as well, and when I started interest in a book and found out, and we don't have any evidence, the eastern cross timbers is gone, and we've had to say goodbye to that because of civilization. But there is one place on the corner of Elm where it turns into Whitley Road, and the corner where the Arby's sits, and there's a great chunk of land that is wild, it's impenetrable. And I look at that and I show people that and say, this is something of what the cross timbers look like. But Keller sits in a place that's right on the edge of the cross timbers. And you go to the west and it becomes prairie. It was an ideal place to come. You could farm out on the west side of it. You could grow crops. You could run your horses. whatever you wanted to do, and then you'd come back inside the forest, inside the trees, and build your home and feel safe.
Okay, so Keller was an ideal spot because of the cross timbers location.
Yes.
I guess they were using the timber to build homes. Is that what they were doing?
Not very often, because the post oaks were not good for building.
They weren't?
And they very often sent east for lumber, for pine to build out of. However, they certainly did some building with logs and that sort of thing here.
Okay. Now, one thing I read in your book that I found interesting is that Keller was initially called Athol.
Yes, it was.
How did that come to be?
Well, Athol is a scripture. It appears in scripture and was the name of someone, I don't remember who. But Athol is also a place in the Scottish Highlands, and the people who settled this area were Scots-Irish. And so, since it's my turn to decide, I've decided that that's why they must have named it Athol, was perhaps they remembered home and where they'd come from. And sure enough, in 1841, a contingent of about 300 families from Missouri came here looking for land, found it, explored it a little bit, and came back in 1844 and then established themselves here along Bear Creek here and up along Marshall Creek close to Roanoke, right on the Denton and Tarrant County line. There still is some land in contention about who owns it.
So Athol became Keller.
Yes.
And where did the name Keller come from?
Well, the Keller name came from a railroad professional. Either he was a supervisor or in some way in charge of what was going on and along the route of the railroad. And he said, if you will name this town after me, I will see that you get a depot. And that's exactly what happened. And so the name of Athol lasted no more than 9 months, less than a year, and the name was changed to Keller.
So about a mile and a half up the road, up 377, the first little town around here was named Double Springs. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. It was north and east of here, and it was a settlement of about 200 people. There was a mill, there was a spring, in fact 2 springs, some other things that would have been, in a small village. But it was just a settlement, just a village. It really wasn't a town. But they had Pony Express deliveries, they had mail deliveries, there were postmasters. When the citizens of Double Springs heard that a train was coming through, and it was not going to pass through Double Springs, it was instead going to pass to the east, the citizens literally picked up their houses and moved them here to Keller. There is one house that was such a house that was moved, and it's at 113 Hill Street, and it was loaded on a wagon, with big beams underneath it and wheels, such as a wagon has, and horses, oxen, pulled those houses here to Keller. And there were several at the time, but time has claimed them all nearly, and they moved themselves here to be close to the tracks, so that they knew there would be comforts, there would be money to be made. They would have some civilization close by, and so that's why they came, and with good reason.
Is the owner of that house the Hill family? Is that a name? Is that original name?
No, the name of the street may have been named after a Hill family. I don't find evidence of a Hill family here, but there certainly could have been. There's much missing that that we don't know.
Right.
And so, or they may have just named it, the Hill Street, like name it after trees or name it after landmarks. So I'm not sure about that.
So the streets in Old Town Keller, we have Bates Streets.
Right.
That's obviously after a family, a prominent family here in Keller, right?
Literally on this street right here.
Where we're sitting today.
Mm-hmm, right.
And that was Alvin Bates, correct?
Right.
Okay. And can you tell us a little bit about Alvin's family?
Well, the most important thing about Alvin's family was that they owned the land that was going to be part of the tracks we're coming across. So they had certainly a vested interest in that train. And Alvin, and I don't know how many children he had, but or his wife, I don't remember what her name was, but they were very involved with pushing land and clearing land and making it possible for the train to come in. The train story begins much earlier. It begins in Fort Worth, as a matter of fact. There was a terrible money problem in 1873. Feature that, a money problem, a Great Recession, all that goes with it. And Fort Worth felt that if they could get the train through Fort Worth, that it would help economically, which of course it did. They had difficulties in that they had missed the deadline with the railroad company for bringing the train in, but they were able to convince the railroad company to give them some more time. So they said, okay, you've got 2 years to bring that train into Fort Worth, and then that's all of it. We will not bring a train through here. Well, they went to work, and the train had stopped at Eagle Ford, which is near Grand Prairie. That was as far as the track went. So they began to lay track, but the deadline began to loom closer and closer. They also had to pass through city government to see if it was all right and to vote it in. The deciding vote was a man who was critically ill, and they carried him in on a stretcher to cast his vote for bringing it in. And so the day was won, at least, for bringing it in. They were so stressed about getting it here that they began to lay track on bare ground without any other thing except something to move the train on. The people in Fort Worth were united in their cause. The men were one thing, but it is said that women from all walks of life, ladies of the night, were working right alongside what might be considered the social aspect of womanhood in Fort Worth, and they worked side by side to help to feed the men, to see that the train rolled in. And sure enough, just before the deadline, the train rolled into Fort Worth on bare tracks that were laid on the bare ground. This was in about 1879. Don't quote me on that, but that's close enough. And then plans began from there to spread out to run the track from Fort Worth, a steam engine, run the track to Keller and some places in between, Watauga for one, Roanoke for another, and headed it north toward Denison. Denison was a large gathering place for lots of things. And I thought they were headed for Denton, but I realized that was wrong. Someone had to straighten me out because I told that as fact and it wasn't true. So they said they went through Watauga and Roanoke were going to be cattle loading places. They were going to load stock there. And whether they carried passengers or not, I don't know, and I've not been able to find out. But I've not looked real hard, so I'll have to do that. But Keller was going to take passengers. And not only that, they were going to load and unload goods from that train in Keller, which is exactly what they did. And so almost immediately when that happened, of course they did build the depot, and the depot is sitting in the back lot of Sam's. That's where the depot was, next closer to the tracks. But they brought all kinds of goods, and with it came drummers who were salesmen that were called drummers. They had all manner of things to sell, and to reach their clientele, they rented horse and buggy from the livery stable owned by the Flemster family and rode out into the country to make their sales, and they'd come back and then they'd get the merchandise and ship it to Keller, and then it would be picked up, and that's how people were able to use the railroad. You can imagine what a help that was to be able to get things that you'd never been able to get before. And not only that, but to think about riding the train. That must have been really big stuff. The Bates family had a lot to do with that, plus the Lopp family and the Pulliam family also helped lay the tracks and clear the brush and make it possible for the train to come in. It was an exciting time. Many of them had never, ever seen a train in their lives. In fact, I expect most of them, unless they had ridden a train somewhere in the vicinity to settle here, which would have been nowhere. I think maybe somewhere north would have been a Bonham up in there somewhere might have been a way to ride the train here or closer to here. They were terribly excited, and when they knew the train was going to roll in, families came from miles around just to see the train, just to look at it. It was a steam engine train, and it made a mighty sound and spread coal dust everywhere. But they brought their picnic baskets and brought their lunches and came to stay and made quite a day. In fact, I expect it lasted more than a day, but that one day that it rolled in first was a mighty big time in Keller, and it would change the face of what went on here in north central Texas. It would make Keller what it is today. And very few people remember that. What's the train? What big deal? Well, it was a big deal. It meant success or failure for this town.
Sometimes it's good to stop and remember that Keller may not even be here had the train.
Exactly. It would not be here without the train. And if that Mr. Keller had not insisted that the town be named for him, therefore a depot, when there was not supposed to be one,
would never have existed.
Never have existed.
Now, while the history of Keller is not really notorious, we're not known for Bonnie and Clyde, who did ride around and create havoc in
he got
neighboring.
Close. Right.
He got close. I think Roanoke maybe in Southlake, but kind of bypassed Keller. Lucky for us, we did have a bank, and that bank was robbed. Right?
Yes, it was.
And I hear this is a very interesting story, and I would like to you to share it with us.
Who robbed the bank.
All right.
The bank was established here, really, in 1921. The bank as we see it today, and the building still exists and is in good shape and has a business in it. The bank officials would have been Jim Jarvis and Cotton. I don't remember Cotton's last name, and maybe Ray White. I'm not sure who the third person was. But the important part is that they got to noticing shortfalls when they count the money. Cotton, who was alive at the time, and I interviewed him, and he said, and it was me they were blaming. He said, I was the new kid on the block, and just brand new and learning the ropes, and they decided I was the one taking the money. And he said, I assured him I was not the one taking the money, and what we must do is watch and wait and see if we could catch the culprit. So they watched and they waited, and they did catch the culprit, which turned out to be a rat, which was coming and stealing the money and putting it in someplace that rats hide things in the walls. And they found out who the culprit was, and so Cotton was relieved and was not hung or put in jail or all the things that might have happened to him if they'd been able to prove he was the culprit.
So it was really a rat.
Really a rat.
So they did away with the rat. And they probably found where the rat was stashing the cash, correct?
They did. At least that's the way the story goes. You have to remember that one reason I named this book, not just a history of Keller, but a folk history of a cross timber settlement, is because the stories they tell are true. The stories they tell are factual according to their own understanding, not necessarily according to history books. And there weren't any history books to write down the history of Keller or any of these other places at first. People were just busy living. And had it not been for people like Lida White, who saved all the bits and scraps of everything she could get her hands on that pertained to the history of Keller, then we would not have a book today. It couldn't have been done without that material. But still, what people tell is their truth. It is what it means to them and the way they heard it. And I hear the stories I hear way back then. I heard, and then you get a story out of that, which may or may not be entirely true, but it's always partly true.
That's why you're a folklorist. I love that.
Right, exactly.
So with all this history that you've found yourself immersed in here in Keller and going through everything, is there one story in particular that stands out to you?
Yes. There are several that stand out, but the one that I like the best and the one that the children like to hear me tell has to do with the Blevins family, who came from, quote, back southeast, the southern states, but the eastern part. And I'm sorry, I don't remember which part they came from, whether it was, I believe it was Tennessee. Tennessee to Arkansas to Texas was the usual route for people coming, but anyway, Tennessee is involved. And one of the children of this family was named Gaines. In fact, they named some children later Gaines Blevins, and the older Gaines was well known to me and to others here in town. But this was another Gaines, a young boy, 12 years old, and it was his job to take care of the stallion. They were going to raise horses, and to take care of the horse herd. That's a pretty big job for a 12-year-old boy. But Gaines certainly did his best. And one night they had made camp, and Gaines, he was the last to go to bed. That was the last thing that had to be done, to see that the stallion and the horses were either tethered or watched so that they wouldn't get away. And Gaines went about his nightly duties, and he came back to camp, And then it is said, he sought a measure of privacy before he went to bed, which is what our mothers have always told us, go to the bathroom before you go to bed. So Gaines went into a plum thicket, which was about the equivalent of the only kind of outhouse you were going to find, but they were very thick. You didn't know what was in there. But Gaines went in to seek that measure of privacy, and in a few minutes came running out and screaming that he'd been bitten by a rattlesnake. Well, you can imagine the commotion in the camp. You know, I'm sure that the ladies lighted lanterns, probably got out, probably whatever they used to disinfect with, probably a bottle of whiskey. They made a pallet to lie Gaines down on, and the men went after that rattlesnake. And in a little while, they came out laughing. It was not a rattlesnake at all. Gaines had sat down on a turkey hen's nest, and she'd pecked him on the bottom. And so he thought that's why he thought he'd been bitten by a rattlesnake.
It was a turkey hen?
Turkey hen guarding her nest.
Joyce, one last question. Can you tell me about this yellow house we are sitting in here today?
This house was built in 1926. The banker, Jim Jarvis, built the house. And in spite of being a banker and a citizen of prominence, it's a very plain house. But in 1912 or 13, Carrie Moon was going to get rid of the house, just mow it down. And Kathy went to him and said, "Can we have the house?" And he said, "You can have it if you'll get it out of here by a certain date." The city very graciously let us have this location and for 25 years. And one of the city councilmen stepped up and paid $25. He said, "Here's your first 25 years rent."
And where was this house originally?
It was on the corner where Texas Blue is now.
Okay, where
that was the
Texas
place.
Blue Steakhouse.
Right,
okay.
But we undertook, with much help, the clearing out of all the brush and trees and things that were in the way, except for one wonderful pecan tree that's still standing there that is a hybrid and puts out the biggest, old, prettiest pecans you ever saw. And out of this whole thing, I want you to know a very important thing happened in my life, and that was that I had a building named after me. Kathy Jackson decided to start calling it the Joycey. So that's not a small thing to me to have a building named after me. We all would like to think we had a building in our name, so I've arrived.
If you want to hear more stories on the history and people of Keller, please be sure to visit the Wild Heritage Museum on 234 Bates Street in Old Town Keller. There you can visit with Kathy Jackson, Peggy Harrison, and on most days, Joyce herself. The museum is open Friday through Sundays, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. And across the street, you can also visit the Train House Depot Museum. Joyce's book can be purchased for $45 plus tax at the museum. It is a wonderful read on the history of Keller. And just as Keller's history is important to us, so too is the future. So please join us on January 23rd for our next podcast, where we will chat with our wonderful mayor, Pat McGrail. We will get to know Mayor McGrail a little better and listen to him talk about the future of Keller. So until then, thank you again for listening to Keen on Keller, and keep up with those New Year resolutions.